All 7 of us are yours now. 7 gorgeous women in the ghost town he paid $5 for. The deed cost me $5 and a handshake from a man who couldn't stop laughing. I remember the exact weight of it, not the deed, the coin. I'd pressed a silver dollar and 4 worn quarters into Hector Vargas's palm, and he'd folded his fingers over them and laughed until his eyes watered. We were standing in the land office in Bisbee, which was a charitable name for what was really a former saloon with a plank across 2 barrels for a counter. The clerk, a thin man with ink on his left cuff and none on his right, had slid the paper across without looking up from whatever he was copying, and Hector had signed as witness still laughing, and I had walked out into the October sun with the deed to a place called Garnet. Population formerly 41, currently none. Or so we both believed. I'd been on the losing end of a lot of things by then. 3 years drifting after the war, 2 years working a mine claim in the Dragoons with 2 men I thought I knew. One turned out to be a thief, the other worse. The thief cleaned out the assay box and rode south the same night the other one, and I went at it over a card game that was really about something else, as those things usually are. And I came out of the claim with a limp in my right knee that hasn't entirely gone away, a scar on my chin from a whiskey bottle, and a settled conviction that men are mostly trouble, and the best thing you can do with your money is keep moving until you find something stationary that nobody else wants. Garnet was that. A ghost town up a canyon road that washed out half the year, a played-out silver strike, 11 buildings still standing, and a scattering of foundations where the others had burned or fallen. The assay records Hector had inherited from his late uncle showed maybe $40 of silver left in the whole operation if you killed yourself getting at it. The buildings, he said, were sound enough. A man could winter there if he wasn't particular. I wasn't particular. I'd stopped being particular about a great many things. I drove a wagon up that canyon road on the 3rd of November with everything I owned in the bed. A bedroll, a cast-iron pan, a short-barreled rifle, 200 rounds, 50 pounds of flour, 30 of salt pork. A small crate of canned goods I didn't examine until later and which turned out to be mostly tomatoes, and a dog I'd picked up in Tombstone who had no name and didn't seem to want one. The road was rough. A section of it had slid into the creek during some past flood, and I had to take the mule through the water, which she did not approve of, and she told me her opinion of it at some length. The dog rode the wagon seat with his paws on the rail and watched the canyon walls with an expression of moderate concern, like a man who has agreed to something but isn't quite settled about what. I came around the last bend at about 4 in the afternoon and got my first look at Garnet. It was better than I'd expected and worse than I'd hoped, which is about the honest ratio of things. The main street was maybe 200 yards long, and the buildings were adobe and rough timber, most with their roofs intact, which was the important part. A sound roof is the beginning of everything else. There was a well in the center of what had been the plaza, a real well, stone-lined, with a rope and a bucket still on it. There was a long building that had been a boarding house and still had most of its interior walls. There was a building with double-width doors that had been a livery, and a smaller one beside it that had been a forge. There was what looked like it had been a dry goods store, shelves still standing inside, tilted but present. There was a building with faded paint on the window that said Assay, and below that, in smaller letters, WHDECKER Prop. And below that, in letters smaller still, Notary. And there was smoke, coming from the chimney of the boarding house. Not much, a thread of it, pale and reluctant against the darkening rock face behind, but smoke, which meant a fire, which meant I was not alone. I sat the wagon a moment. The mule put her head down and blew hard. The dog looked at the smoke and then at me, and I reached back and got my rifle from behind the seat and climbed down. The dog jumped down after me, and we walked across the plaza together, me with the rifle and the dog with no weapon, which was our usual arrangement. What I found when I pushed open the boarding house door was a woman of maybe 55, iron-haired, broad-shouldered, with the particular posture of a person who has decided not to be afraid of whatever comes through the door. She was sitting at a plank table shelling dried beans into a crockery bowl, a sound like slow rain, and she looked up at me and at the rifle with the same measuring expression, not alarmed, just weighing, and said in a voice as flat and unhurried as a mesa in August, "Put that down. There's nobody here but me, and I've got more right to this building than you do. I was here first." I put the rifle down, not because she told me to particularly, but because she wasn't wrong. Her name was Nora Giddings. She'd ranched 12 miles east with her husband for 19 years, and her husband had died in August of a bad lung, and her husband's brother had ridden out from Tucson in September with a court paper that said the original deed had been in the brother's name, and she had 30 days to vacate. She'd taken the 30 days. She'd also taken the good mule, the wagon, the cook stove, 200 pounds of winter provisions, her husband's Sharps rifle, and every piece of furniture she could fit in the wagon, on the grounds that the furniture was hers regardless of what paper said about the land. And the brother could go argue about it with a judge in Tucson if he felt strongly, which was a 40-mile ride and a $2 filing fee, and she didn't expect he'd bother. She'd come to Garnet because she'd passed through it 10 years prior and remembered it as empty, and more importantly, sheltered from the north wind by the canyon walls, which she'd noted at the time as the kind of observation a practical person saves. "You bought this?" she said, looking at the deed I showed her. $5. She turned it over in her hands, looked at both sides, handed it back. "Who'd you buy it from?" "Hector Vargas. He inherited it from an uncle." "What uncle?" "A man named Decker, I believe, had the notary." She sat a moment without speaking, shelling another line of beans, the pop and rattle of them into the bowl, the fire in the hearth behind her making the room the only warm room I'd been in 3 weeks. "Decker was a scoundrel," she said finally. "Half the town knew it before it emptied out. He probably stole the deed from whoever actually owned this place, which means your $5 deed may or may not be worth the paper it's written on." "I figure I'll find out," I said. She looked at me again. That particular look, not hostile, not welcoming, just a long, frank weighing, the kind that women develop when they've learned that a man's face and his intentions are often different things. "You planning to run me off?" "I'm planning to have supper," I said, "if you've got enough in that pot." She had enough. She always had enough. I came to understand that about Nora over the months that followed, that she provisioned with a margin the way an experienced person provisions in country where resupply is uncertain. There was always more than it appeared. We ate at the plank table without saying much, because there wasn't much that needed saying, and we were both the kind of people who understood that silence at a table isn't failure. After supper, I took the east room at the end of the hall, which still had a bed frame and rope slats, and I rolled out my bedroll and slept better than I had in 6 months. That was November 3rd. The first night of something I didn't have a name for yet. Magdalena arrived on November 7th, and she came with children. I was on the roof of the boarding house replacing a section of cedar shakes that had lifted in the October wind, and I heard the wagon before I saw it, an uneven wheel knock, the sound of one loose iron tire hitting stone on every third rotation. She came up the canyon road with a gray mule and a wagon that was overloaded and listing left, and she was driving alone. Mexican, early 30s, with dark eyes and the kind of face that doesn't waste expression. She had a baby on the seat beside her wrapped in a wool rebozo with the sleeping weight of a very young child, and 2 small girls in the wagon bed sitting absolutely still and straight, watching the canyon walls with the careful attention of children who have learned that new places require assessment before they require anything else. She pulled up in the street and looked at the buildings in order, each one, the way you look at terrain when you're trying to understand it, and then she looked up at me on the roof. "Is this Garnet?" "What's left of it?" She took in the plaza, the well, the boarding house smoke from the chimney behind me. "The senora at the dry goods store in Bisbee said there might be a place here to shelter for the winter, a man who was fixing things." I hadn't said anything like that to anyone in Bisbee. I had mentioned it to Hector, though, and Hector Vargas knew approximately everyone within a 100-mile radius, and had opinions about what information should travel where. "There's room," I said. Her name was Magdalena Reyes. Her husband had been a vaquero for a cattle operation near Canania on the Sonora side, and when the ranch went under he'd ridden north looking for work, and he had not come back. She'd stopped waiting for explanation of this fact, and had moved to simply stating it. He had not come back. She was a seamstress. She had thread and needles and a sewing frame folded flat in the wagon, and she could mend anything and make most things from cloth and decent material, and she asked for nothing beyond a room and the chance to pay for it with her hands. I helped her unload. Nora met us at the door and fed the children before she asked a single question about Magdalena herself, which I noticed, and which I think Magdalena noticed too, that deliberate order of attention. The girls were named Pillar and Consuelo, 4 and 6 respectively. The baby was 3 months old and hadn't been named yet, which Magdalena said was not unusual. She was waiting to see what name fit. I put them in the middle room, which had the advantage of being nearest the kitchen stove, and went back up to finish the roof. Clara Hames came 11 days after that, which was the same morning the north wind came down for the first time and made me deeply glad the shakes were tight. She arrived on a dun horse with 2 saddlebags and a wooden crate of books roped behind her saddle, which is not the standard kit of someone expecting a short stay. She was young, 22, 23, with the particular posture of a person who stands in front of groups of people and has learned not to look uncertain even when she is. She'd been teaching school in a settlement 30 miles south that had folded in the late summer drought, the settlers pulling out for California in August, and she'd stayed through September hoping the situation would reverse, and it hadn't. She asked if there was anyone here who needed teaching, or if anyone here wanted to learn anything. Nora said the girls needed school. She said herself she didn't read particularly well and wouldn't say no to an attempt. I told Clara there were 7 fully sound buildings and 3 partial ones, and she asked who owned them, and I said I did, and she looked at me the way she looked at things, directly, without ceremony, and said, "You're not a prospector." "Not anymore." "What are you then?" I thought about it. "Whatever needs doing," I said. She seemed to find this acceptable. She took the front room, which had more window light than the others, and converted it into both her quarters and the school, with the crate of books on a shelf made from a plank across 2 bricks by the time I'd turned her horse out with the mules. The old woman came 4 days after Clara. She was Tohono Wadam, and she gave her name as something in her language that translated loosely as finds the crack in the rock. She said I could call her Frances, which was the name the missionaries had given her, and which she used when it was convenient. She came on foot up the canyon road, 4 miles of uphill from the main trail, and she was carrying a pack that would have staggered a man half her age. She declined any help with it. She had a medicine bag at her belt that smelled of juniper and something else, something green and sharp that I couldn't name, and she looked at the boarding house the way a craftsman looks at a tool before deciding whether it's adequate for the task. "Who is sick here?" she said. "Nobody right now." She looked at me with eyes that had no sentimentality in them at all, not hostile, just precise, the way a doctor's eyes are precise. "Somebody will be. You have wood laid in." "2 cords. You'll need more." She looked past me into the building. "That back room, the one with the south-facing window, is it occupied?" "No." "Then it's mine." She walked in past me, which settled the matter. She spent the first 2 days conducting a survey of every plant within a half-mile of town that she considered worth knowing, coming back each evening with things bundled in old cloth, which she hung from the rafters of her room to dry. I went in to look once, and the smell was extraordinary, not unpleasant, but dense, like the entire desert had compressed itself into one room. She explained some of what she had, and what it was for, and then stopped. Not because she was being secretive, but because she seemed to judge I had enough information, and more would be wasted. I cut another cord of wood the next day. 2 days later, I cut a third. The 5th woman was the one I came closest to handling wrong, not in terms of what I did, but in terms of what she'd been through before she got here, which made my part feel smaller than it was and larger than it was at the same time. Her name was Rosalind Marsh, and she arrived on December 2nd in a buckboard driven by a man I disliked before he opened his mouth. He was red-faced and heavy, with the specific kind of weight that isn't fat but isn't health either, and he had the set of a man for whom his own size has been the resolution of enough arguments that he doesn't bother with preamble anymore. Rosalind got down from the buckboard fast, the particular speed of someone putting distance between herself and a vehicle, not hurrying away but creating space. And she had a carpet bag and a bruise on her jaw that was 4 or 5 days old, going the yellow-green of old damage. The man sat up on the buckboard and looked at the buildings. He looked at me. He said, "She's not staying here. This place is nothing. She's coming back." Rosalind stood in the street with the carpet bag at her feet and didn't move. He set the brake and climbed down. He was a head taller than me and 50 pounds heavier, and he walked across the street with the assurance of a man who expects the walking itself to settle things. I'd known men like that, and I'd learned that they're usually right about the walking, which means you have to do something that interrupts the assumption before it becomes a fact. I stepped between them. I held out my hand, palm up, not a shove, just a stop, and I said, "She stays if she wants to stay. This is my property, and I'm asking you to ride back down." He looked at my hand. He looked at my face. His eyes went to the rifle leaning against the boarding house wall, close enough to be relevant, far enough to not be a drawn weapon, and then back to my face. He called me something. He called Rosalind something considerably worse. Then he walked back to the buckboard, climbed in, turned it around, and I listened to the wheel knock going down the canyon road until the canyon swallowed the sound of it, and there was only the wind again. I turned around. Rosalind was still standing in the street, hadn't moved, and she didn't look shaken or grateful or any of the things you might expect. She looked very still, the way a person looks when they've been holding something together for a long time and have only just set it down. "That's Clement Marsh," she said. "My husband, or the man I married. You're done with him if you want to be." She picked up the carpet bag. "I've been done with him for 4 years," she said. "It just took until now to leave." She was 24 years old, Missouri originally. She'd been keeping the books for Clement's freighting operation since she was 17, since before the marriage, actually, when she'd been doing accounts for her father and Clement had hired her father, and noticed the books were better than the man keeping them. She had a way of reducing any situation to its arithmetic that I came to rely on completely, and she had the clear-eyed judgment of a person who has spent years watching money move and knows what that reveals about people. She asked if there was accounting to be done. I told her there was no accounting because there was no money. She said that wasn't entirely right. There was inventory, which was a form of accounting, and there was labor, which had value whether or not it was paid, and there was the matter of knowing what you had and what you needed, and she could do that. Within a week, she had a list of every resource in the town on a board nailed to the wall of the former dry goods store, which she'd claimed as an office and supply room. Within 2 weeks, the list had priorities and timelines. Within a month, she had us operating with the efficiency of a small organization that knew what it was doing, which we were not yet, but her lists had a way of making it feel that way, and feeling competent turned out to be almost as useful as actually being competent. Pearl Whitmore came in January, on a morning when the ground was frozen so hard it rang like iron underfoot. She was in her mid-40s, I judged, but there was a quality to her, a way of moving, of weighing a room before she entered it, that made age feel like an irrelevant category. She'd been singing in Tucson, in one of the places that considered itself a better class of establishment, until a man with money and the kind of influence that money buys had decided he had more claim on her time and her attention than she'd agreed to, and the management had found his interpretation of the situation more convenient than hers. She had left. She drove a small rig with a good horse, which told you something about her means and her planning, and she had a trunk in the back that turned out to contain a guitar, a fiddle, 3 volumes of poetry she'd been carrying since Baltimore, a set of bone-handled throwing knives, and considerably more practical sense than any of that might suggest. She looked at Garnet the way Pearl looked at everything, with a long, considering pleasure, like she was deciding something in her own favor, something that had already gone well. "You know what you have here," she said. "Buildings," I said, 7 sound ones. She shook her head slowly. "You have a town," she said. "You just don't see it yet." I started to understand what she meant in February, when the worst cold had settled in, and the canyon held us all close together, and there were 7 of us in that boarding house. Pearl and Rosalind sharing the big south room, Clara at the front with her books, Magdalena and the children in the middle room with the cookstove warmth bleeding through the wall, Frances in the back with her hanging medicines and her 2-day surveys, Nora in the room she'd claimed in November and organized into the closest thing to a proper domestic arrangement any of us had known since leaving wherever we'd each come from, and me at the end of the East Hall with the dog. 7 lives with particular skills and particular ways of being in the world, none of them interchangeable, none of them simple. What I noticed, February cold notwithstanding, was that it worked. Not easily, nothing is easy when 7 people live close in limited space in winter. There were mornings the temper in the kitchen was as sharp as the temperature outside. There were evenings when someone needed to be left alone, and the building wasn't large enough for that, which required a kind of tact from everyone that you can't ask for and can only hope people produce on their own. But it worked, In the way things work when the people involved have all been through enough to know that being difficult about small things is a luxury they can't afford. Nora ran the kitchen with the organizational clarity of a campaign. She did it with help. Magdalena's cooking was better than hers in certain ways, and she knew it. And they'd worked out, without discussion, a division of authority that was entirely practical and entirely unspoken. Clara taught the girls every morning, and by February had added Nora to the afternoon session and Pearl to Thursday evenings, and had told me, in a tone that was polite but didn't leave much room, that I was expected Thursday evenings as well. I came. Francis kept us healthy. There was a bout of lung sickness in January that came for Magdalena's older girl first and then for Nora, and without Francis, I don't know how either of them would have gone. She sat through the nights when the fever was high, dosing and watching with the attentiveness of a person who has done this before, many times in harder conditions. When Nora was well enough to speak, the first coherent thing she said was to ask Francis what she needed. What could Nora give her in return? And Francis said she needed the good pot kept clean and her left boot resoled, which Magdalena did within the week. It was around that time I fixed the lock on the storeroom door. It hadn't needed one before, but a man had ridden up the canyon in early February, the freight agent from Clement's operation, come asking about Rosalind's whereabouts, and he'd walked through the building with an ease that I didn't like. And afterward, I put a proper lock on the storeroom and a bar on the back door and a length of cord on the front room window that would make noise if anyone tried it in the night. Rosalind noticed. She didn't say anything to me directly. She told Nora, who told me months later, that it was the first time in her adult life that someone had secured a space she was in without being asked or compensated for it, and that she'd sat in the supply room for 10 minutes after noticing and hadn't done any accounting at all, which was apparently unusual. I put in the third and fourth cords of wood in March, when a break in the weather gave me 2 good days. The 7th woman arrived that same month, and she came with a son. Her name was Wren Sleeping Bear. She was Cheyenne, a widow. Her husband had been killed 3 years before in one of the skirmishes that didn't get recorded anywhere as skirmishes, just as incidents or disturbances, which is one way the world makes certain things smaller than they are. She'd been living near a settlement that had decided over the winter to become less hospitable to anyone who wasn't white, and the less hospitable had expressed itself in the form of broken windows, then a pig's head on her doorstep, then a group of men in the street at night making noise that was specifically designed to communicate what might come next. Wren had put her son on the horse and ridden before it came next. She arrived with mud to the horse's knees, which meant she'd come through the creek crossing at the bad part, and she knocked on the boarding house door. I noticed that she knocked, rather than calling out. She'd learned or been taught by circumstances to present herself carefully and wait for invitation rather than assume it. I opened the door. She was 30 or so, with the particular quality of composure that comes not from being unafraid, but from having decided that showing fear was something she couldn't afford. Her son was 9, standing at her side and slightly in front of her, which told me something about both of them. I was told there might be shelter here, she said. I can work, my son can work. Behind me, the house was alive with its usual sounds. Nora at the stove, the baby making a sound, Clara's lesson voice in the front room, the dog's nails on the floor. Come in, I said. There's room and there's supper. It took Wren 2 weeks to stop watching the door. I didn't remark on it. I understood it, and I had nothing to say about it except to make sure the door was secured at night, and that trouble, when it came, was dealt with before it got inside. Her son's name was Thomas. He was careful and precise, and had a gift for numbers that Rosalind spotted within days, sitting him down to check an inventory list she'd already totaled and finding, without apparent surprise, that he'd done it faster and without error. She took him on as her assistant without ceremony, and he accepted the role with the gravity of a much older person, which Rosalind seemed to find entirely appropriate. Wren herself was a beadworker. Not just the decorative kind, though she did that too. The technical kind, the kind that encodes information, that maps terrain and tells history in a visual grammar that goes back further than writing. She and Francis found each other within the first week in the way that people with deep practical knowledge sometimes find each other. Cautiously, then with increasing interest, comparing what they knew by 2 different routes, until they were having conversations that no one else entirely followed, and both of them seemed to prefer it that way. So that was 7. 7 women and a boy and 2 mules and 1 nameless dog and a cat that had appeared in February and been named by Magdalena's youngest Senor Bones on account of his dimensions. What I remember about that first winter, the real winter, February and into March, is the smallness of it, and how the smallness was its own kind of warmth. The building had 12 rooms and we occupied 8 of them. The stove in the kitchen heated the center of the place, and the rooms faded from warm to cold as you moved away from it, which meant everyone tended to congregate toward the middle in the evenings, in the corridor outside the kitchen and the room just off it that had been the boarding house's sitting room. We'd moved a bench in there and 2 chairs and a stool, and in the evenings after supper we'd sit in various arrangements and someone would usually be talking, and someone else would be doing something with their hands. Magdalena with her sewing frame, Rosalind with the accounts, Frances sorting the day's dried plants into paper packets, Wren beating, Clara with a book, and the dog would be under the bench and Senor Bones would be wherever he decided was appropriate, which changed nightly and which he regarded as his prerogative. I'd sit with them sometimes, which had not been my habit before. I'm not a man who'd spent much time sitting in rooms with people in a companionable way. The life I'd lived didn't have much of that. But there was something about that sitting room in February that made it feel less optional than I was used to, which I couldn't have explained and didn't try to. I'd sit and listen, or contribute when there was something worth contributing, and after a while I noticed that my presence seemed to be expected isn't quite the right word. Expected would mean it was required. What it was that when I didn't come in after supper, someone came to find me. Not with urgency, not with any implication that I'd done something wrong. Just Nora appearing in the hall to say there was tea or Clara asking if I'd eaten. Small things, the kind that don't have a name. The first time one of the girls climbed into my lap, I didn't know what to do with that. Pillar, the older one, Magdalena's daughter. She was 6 and had been watching me repair a hinge at the kitchen table with the close attention of a child who watches unfamiliar processes, and then she had simply climbed up and watched from closer, as if nearness improved the view. And when the hinge was done, she stayed and I didn't move her, and after a while she was asleep. Magdalena looked in from the stove and looked at me and looked at her daughter and went back to what she was doing without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. I'd forgotten what it was to be in a place where a child did that, where you were, without apparent effort or intention, the kind of presence a child found safe enough to fall asleep on. I was the one who kept the shell of the place functional. That's the honest way to say it. I kept the roofs tight and the water flowing and the wood split and the road through the canyon passable after snowfall. I went to Bisbee when we needed things and came back with what the accounting said we needed in the order it said we needed it. I fixed what broke. I stood at the door when trouble came. Trouble came with some regularity. Rosalind's husband sent 2 men in May, large men on good horses, who rode up the canyon with the confident bearing of men who'd been told this would be simple. I met them in the street. I had the rifle, and I had the patience of a man who's been in enough situations to know that most of them resolve without shooting if you hold still and let the other party calculate the odds. They calculated for a while. I could see them doing it, looking at the rifle and the dog and the town behind me and whatever was in my face, running the numbers, and then they left. Inside the boarding house behind me, I'd known that 6 women were listening, not from fear, at least not most of them, from something closer to attention, the kind you pay when something important is happening and you want to understand it. After the men left, I went to the forge and spent the afternoon on a hinge that needed regrinding. About an hour in, Nora brought me coffee. She didn't say anything about what had happened. She set the cup on the edge of the forge, looked at me for a moment with the same flat, assessing expression she'd used the night we met, and went back inside. The coffee was very strong and very hot, and exactly what I needed. I rode down to the county seat the following week and had a conversation with the sheriff that took most of a day and cost me the price of 2 meals and a great deal of careful language, but which resulted in a paper that said, in the relevant legal terms, that Rosalind Marsh had established lawful domicile in Garnet, and any attempts to compel her removal would be treated as the criminal matter they were. I didn't tell Rosalind I'd done this. Thomas told her because Thomas had seen the paperwork on my desk. She came to the forge one morning while I was working on a wagon trace and stood until I put the tool down and said, "You went to the county seat." "I did. You didn't tell me. Didn't want to get your hopes up if it didn't work." She looked at me for a long moment. "I want you to hear something," she said, "and I want you to hear it without deflecting it. Standing between me and Clement in December was the first time in 7 years that anyone did something for me without wanting something in return. And now this." She held my gaze. "I know you'll say it was practical. I'm asking you not to. Just hear it." I heard it. I didn't say much back, because there wasn't much to say that wouldn't make it smaller. A man came through in August who looked at what we had in Garnet and made a remark about the nature of the arrangement that was designed to be offensive. He made the remark in the street, in a tone calculated to carry, and it did. I was at the well and I heard it clearly. I walked over and I told him, in some detail, what my understanding of the situation was, and what I was prepared to do if he continued to express his alternative understanding. He was on his horse and moving before I finished the second sentence, and I watched him go until the canyon road bent and he was out of sight. When I came back inside, Pearl was in the doorway. She'd heard all of it. The street wasn't large. She looked at me and said simply, "Thank you," and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and I went back to the well, and neither of us made it larger than it was. That was how those things went at Garnet, which was one of the things I had come to value most about it. Nothing was made larger than it was, but nothing was made smaller either. The things that mattered were allowed to matter without ceremony. After the August incident, word traveled in the way that word travels in small communities, which is quickly and with embellishment, but the substance of it was accurate. Garnet was not a place where that kind of trouble landed and stuck. This had two effects. The bad kind of men rode past without stopping. The other kind began to come through with increasing frequency. People looking for work, for trade, for the school eventually, which had 3 enrolled students from 2 families who'd settled in the canyon by fall, and then more. It was Pearl who named what was happening, on an April evening when the year had turned warm. She had her guitar across her lap on the boarding house step, not playing it, just holding it the way a person holds something familiar. She said, "You know what Nora told me?" "No." "She said when you got here in November and she told you she had more right to this building than you, she expected you to run her off or argue. One or the other. That's what she'd gotten from men in the year since her husband died." "She had the fire going," I said. "I needed the heat." Pearl smiled, the small kind. "She said she decided you were either very shrewd or very decent and she wasn't sure which. She's since decided both." She paused. "I want to say something and I want you to hear it. You're a man who deflects, I've noticed. When something good is said about what you've done, you redirect it toward the practical, the fire, the heat. You didn't want to get hopes up. Francis said you'd need more wood. You have an explanation for everything that makes it sound like accounting rather than character." I looked at the last light on the canyon wall. "So I'm going to say this plainly," Pearl said, "and I'm asking you to let it land without redirecting it. You didn't have to keep this place. You spent $5 on a deed that might not be worth $5, and you could have wintered here alone and ridden out in April. Nobody would have blamed you. We all expected that, honestly, that's the pattern. A man lights somewhere, and when it gets complicated, he moves." She paused. "But you dug the extra woodpile because Francis said so. You fixed Rosalind's paperwork and didn't tell her. You put the lock on the storeroom after the freight agent came through, which I noticed before Rosalind did. You rode to the county seat. You stood in the street in December between Rosalind and a man considerably larger than you, and you did it without making it dramatic, which is harder than the dramatic version. The canyon wall had gone from gold to the first gray of dusk. All 7 of us have talked about this," Pearl said. "Not a meeting, we didn't have a meeting. It was in pieces the way women talk over weeks. And what we all said, separately and in different ways, is that we want to stay here, not because there's nowhere else to go. Rosalind has people in New Mexico. Clara's family is in Santa Fe. Wren has cousins south of here who would take her in." She looked at me directly. "We want to stay in Garnet, in your town. With the man who made it worth staying in." I sat with that. 7 women, I said. 7 women, she said, who between them have had enough experience of men and the world to know exactly what they're choosing and why. She put her hand on my arm, a firm, plain placement of it, not tentative, not sentimental, just certain. "All 7 of us are yours now, and we'd like it if you understood that that's not a small thing." "I understand it," I said. "Good," she said, and she took her hand back and picked up the guitar and began to play something low and wandering, following whatever the notes suggested, and I sat beside her while the canyon went from gold to purple to the first dark, and the stars came out one at a time, And inside the boarding house, the sounds of the house went on, Nora's footsteps. Someone laughing, Thomas's voice asking Rosalind a question, Rosalind answering it with the precise focus she brought to everything. After Pearl opened that door, things got said more plainly by everyone who walked through it. I want to say something about the nature of what I was doing here that is harder to say than the practical parts. I had not before Garnet been a man who thought much about the impression he made on the people around him. You live enough years by yourself and with men who aren't particularly interested in you as a person, only in what you can do or what you know or whether you'll hold up when things get difficult, and you stop expecting to be seen in any fuller way than that. I thought of myself as useful or not useful, competent or not competent, present or not present. That was the vocabulary I had for myself. What the women at Garnet did, over the months that followed Pearl's April conversation, was teach me a different vocabulary. Not by sitting me down and explaining it. They weren't that kind of people, any of them. They did it the way they did most things, practically, without announcement, by treating me as though certain things about me were simply facts that everyone already knew and there was no need to make a production of acknowledging. Nora included me in the kitchen decisions as though my opinion of the provisions schedule was naturally relevant. Clara included me in the school's surveying curriculum as though my practical knowledge was naturally worth teaching. Rosalind showed me the accounting each week not as a report, but as a shared concern, as though the operation of the place was something we were both responsible for in different ways. Wren asked my opinion of a beading design once, not in a way that suggested she needed my approval, but in a way that suggested she was curious what I saw that she might not. Frances left the fourth cord of wood. I'd cut a specific note of appreciation, which from Frances was the equivalent of a speech, and which she delivered by placing a single wintergreen leaf on the stack, which I understood only after she explained it, which she did by saying, "In my tradition, this means the work was seen." Then she walked away. What they were doing, all of them, in their different ways, was making it plain that they saw me. Not just what I could do, me. The particular man who had come up a canyon road in November with a worthless deed and a nameless dog, and more years of hard use behind him than most men wanted to examine closely. They saw that man and they had collectively decided that he was the man they wanted in the house and at the door and at the table, and they said so in the steady daily language of including him, which turns out to be the most convincing language there is. I hadn't known before that I needed that. After Pearl opened that door, things got said more plainly by everyone who walked through it. Nora told me over breakfast one morning that she'd been afraid her whole life of ending up without a place and without people, and that she'd stopped being afraid, and she wanted me to know the reason. She said it looking at her coffee, the way you say things you mean but aren't practiced at saying, and when she looked up I nodded, and she nodded back, and that was enough between us. Magdalena's baby had been named in March, and the name she'd chosen was Barclay. My name, my last name, which is what I generally go by. When I looked at her over this, she said the baby had been born in October on a very bad night, the worst she could remember, and the next morning I had come up the canyon road and fixed the roof and made things a little safer, and when she'd needed an anchor for the night, the name had seemed right. She said it plainly, without apology or sentiment, and I didn't say much back because there wasn't much to say. The baby looked at me with the specific and curious expression of a baby who has been given a name and doesn't yet understand what names cost or what they mean. Frances gave me a small cloth bag in November of the second year, filled with things I couldn't fully identify by smell. She said it was for sleeping well. When I asked why sleeping well was her business, she said a man who kept other people safe had to sleep, and she was making sure of it. She said this without warmth or sentiment as a statement of logistics, which was the highest form of care she expressed, and which I'd learned to recognize as such. Clara put me in the Thursday class permanently by summer, and we worked through a surveying course together. She knew the method, I knew the practical from 2 years of staking mining claims, and we produced a proper survey of Garnet and the surrounding land in a composition book, with measurements and her neat notation. Rosalind used it to draw a property map that went to the county recorder in Bisbee, and for the first time the town had a legal existence that extended beyond one $5 deed of questionable provenance. Wren beaded me a patch in July. She pressed it into my hand one morning without ceremony while I was checking the harness on the mule. It was the size of a hand, and it showed the canyon from above, the canyon as seen by something with far better eyes than a man. In it were figures, a man at the center, upright and still, and 7 others in a ring around him, equidistant, not crowding him but not separate either. No faces, just shapes that were unmistakably people. She gave it to me and said, "So you know what you hold." Then she walked away before I could answer. I still have it. I'll have it until I'm done with having things. The second winter, then the third. Clement gave up sending men in the fall. He filed a complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson, which resulted in a deputy who spent one afternoon asking questions and listening to Rosalind describe, in precise and well-organized terms, 7 years of her husband's conduct, and who rode back to Tucson having revised his understanding of the situation considerably. The men from the settlement that had driven Wren out, 3 of them, on a cold December morning, rode up the canyon road under the apparent impression that the situation was simpler than it was. They found me in the street with the rifle and the dog, and as it happened, Thomas's accounting ledger, which I'd picked up from the step where he'd left it to keep it from blowing away, and which I still had in my hand when they pulled up. I'm told, second-hand, that the image of a man standing in a ghost town street holding a child's ledger and not appearing to find this at all incongruous had been somehow the most alarming part of the encounter. I don't know if that's true. What I know is that they looked at me and at the rifle and at the dog and rode back down the canyon, and I went inside and put the ledger back where Thomas had left it. The town grew in ways I hadn't planned for. Rosalind organized the freighting from an idea. We needed things from Bisbee on a regular basis, and it was more efficient to bring things for others at the same time, and then more efficient still to do it on a schedule, and then to charge for the schedule. And within a year it was a real operation with 2 wagons and a contract. Thomas ran the books. He was 12 by then, and he ran them with a precision that made grown men uncomfortable, which Rosalind found satisfying. Clara's school went from 2 students to 8 to 14. She hired an assistant from a family that had settled in the canyon and expanded into the building next to the boarding house that I'd repaired over the fall. By the 3rd year, it was a proper schoolhouse with a bell I cast in the forge. Not my best work. 3 attempts before I got one that rang true, and word of it had spread far enough that families were citing the school as a reason for settling in the canyon. Pearl played on Sunday evenings. This had become what it became without anyone deciding it. She played, and whoever was in town came, and the Sunday evenings were what the town's social life organized itself around without a vote or a plan or anyone naming it as such. She played everything from hymns to corridos to things she'd composed on long afternoons when the canyon was quiet. She had a way, while she played, of looking at each person in the room once, a brief, level look, the way a person confirms that everyone present is accounted for. Frances had a second room by the 3rd year, for patients who needed to stay. She'd established herself, without seeking it, as the medical resource for a radius of 30 miles. People came to her with things that ranged from broken bones to fevers to the kind of persistent difficulties that don't have simple physical names, and she treated all of it with the same level attention, charged nothing she knew a family couldn't pay, and kept the accounts of what she'd treated in a notebook she allowed no one to read. Nora had a garden by the 2nd summer. Not large, the canyon floor was rocky and the water had to be managed, but a real garden, with rows and a fence and the attentiveness of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. She grew things that extended the winter provisions and gave the kitchen a range it hadn't had. By the 3rd summer, she had enough to trade with the settlement down the canyon. She did this with the organized efficiency she brought to everything, which is the efficiency of a woman who ran a ranch operation for 19 years and didn't lose the habit when she lost the ranch. Magdalena's sewing had become a proper operation by the 2nd year. She had 2 women from the settlement working with her, one of them her own elder daughter, Pillar, who was 8 and already particular about her stitching, and they produced work that Rosalind sold through the Bisbee trader and then through a connection in Tucson. The baby Barclay had by the age of 2 developed the habit of sitting in the workroom holding pieces of cloth up to the light and making pronouncements about them that the women found useful, which suggested to me he was going to be either a particular nuisance or a person of genuine taste, and possibly both. Wren's beadwork went through Rosalind's operation to the Tucson connection, and from there to Santa Fe and eventually to buyers in St. Louis, which none of us had expected. Thomas negotiated the prices. He was 15 when he conducted his first negotiation with the Santa Fe buyer by letter, and he was better at it than most men I'd met in my life. Ren watched this without appearing surprised, the way a person watches something they expected. I was past 50 by then. The knee was worse in cold weather, which Frances had predicted, and she'd made something for it that I used without asking what was in it, which was my part of the arrangement. I had gray at my temples and more of it in my beard, and I looked like what I was, a man who'd worked hard in the sun for a long time and had something to show for it other than money. I was also the man who owned a town, not in the way it sounds. I didn't manage Garnet the way a man manages property. I was the hinge of it, maybe. The thing that held the structure together so everything else could move freely. I kept fixing what broke. I kept the road clear. I kept the water in the cistern and the wood in the pile and the integrity of the place intact, meaning that trouble which came for any one person here came through me first. This is the part that's hard to say right. I'd spent the years before Garnet believing that what I was good for was a limited thing. Mining, riding, shooting, the practical work of the frontier, none of which adds up to anything if you don't have a stake in it. I'd had stakes and lost them. I'd had partners and they'd proved untrustworthy. I'd had enough years of being the capable man in a situation that went badly to have concluded, quietly, that capability without a place to use it right isn't worth much. Garnet gave me the place. And place is not a small thing. People talk about it like it is, like land and buildings are interchangeable, like one set of walls is the same as another, like home is a word you can use loosely without losing anything by the looseness. But a place has particular dimensions. It has a particular light and a particular wind, and a particular way the sound of it reaches you. It has particular people in it who have chosen to be there, which is the most particular thing of all. When I rode up that canyon road in November, the canyon walls were just rock. 12 months later, they were the walls of something I would not have wanted to be without. What I did in that 12 months was work. Fix things, carry things, stand at the door, the ordinary labor of maintaining a place and the ordinary firmness of keeping what you have. None of it dramatic, any of it useful. A man who works and holds his ground, that's not a special kind of man. That's just a man doing what the situation requires. The special thing, the thing I couldn't have anticipated, was what happened on the other side of the work. You fix a roof, and a woman's children are warm, and she sees you as the man who fixed the roof, and after a while she names her baby after you. You stand between a frightened woman and the man who's been frightening her, and a year later, she's running an operation that sends goods to Santa Fe. And the look she gives you when she mentions you to people is the look of a person giving credit where it was genuinely due. You cut a third cord of wood because an old medicine woman told you to, and she leaves a wintergreen leaf on the stack to say the work was seen. Seen, that's the word. I had not expected to be seen. I had not, if I'm honest, thought I deserved to be seen, which is a different and more fundamental problem. A man who believes he deserves to be overlooked will make himself easy to overlook, and then when it happens he will feel confirmed rather than wronged, and this can go on for a very long time without being examined. What Garnet did, what the 7 women in Garnet did, was examine it. Not directly, not with confrontation or pointed questions, just by refusing steadily and without comment to overlook me, by including me, by naming babies and pressing beadwork into my hand and leaving leaves on wood piles and asking me to come to Thursday school and saying, plainly on April evenings on the step, all 7 of us are yours now. What the women gave me was something I didn't have a name for until Pearl said it, the knowledge of what I held, not property, not a deed worth $5 on the high end, something that can't be assayed and doesn't fit in a ledger, 7 lives that had chosen to organize themselves around a person they decided was worth organizing around. That's not a small thing. I know it isn't now. I'm past 60. The knee has got to where Frances's remedy isn't entirely equal to it in the coldest weeks, and I walk with a stick then, which I don't mind except that the dog used to walk beside me and there's no dog now. He died 3 years ago, old age and full measure. I buried him under the cottonwood at the edge of the plaza, which is a proper cemetery now, with 6 graves in it, all of them people who came to Garnet in various states of need and chose to have it be their last place. I'll be in that cemetery too, which doesn't trouble me. It's the right company. There's a version of the story I could tell you that makes me sound larger than I am. The man who came to a ghost town and built it into something, who stood at the door and held the line and was rewarded for it. That version isn't wrong exactly, but it's missing something. What it's missing is the February evenings in the sitting room, pillar asleep on my lap while I repaired a hinge, The sound of Pearl's guitar through the wall before she knew I was listening. Nora's coffee, strong and hot, set down on the edge of the forge without a word said. Thomas's accounting ledger, still slightly warm in my hand when I handed it back to him, having defended the town while holding it. Those are the things that held me. Not the deeds, not the standoffs, not the papers from the county seat. The small, true things. The evidence, accumulated over years and still accumulating, that I was in a place where I was known, and where being known was not a liability. Men around my age, the men I'd known, the ones I'd worked with and drifted with and occasionally fought with, most of them never got that. They went through their lives being useful and being capable and being, when required, brave, and they were never really seen for it. They aged into the category of worked out, the way a mine ages into played out, and they felt it, and the feeling hardened them until the hardness was all that was left. I almost went that way. I was pointed that direction. Garnet stopped me pointing that way. 7 women stopped me pointing that way. And what I have instead of the hardness is this. A town in a canyon, a cottonwood I grew from a cutting, a bell I cast on the 3rd try, a piece of beadwork in my breast pocket that shows the canyon from above with a man at the center of a ring of 7, and the knowledge, settled deep, certain as the canyon walls, of what I hold and what it means. Nora's hair is entirely white now. She still runs the kitchen with the organizational clarity of a campaign, though she has more help than she once did and gives more orders than she takes, which suits her. She and Clara have a friendship that I think surprised both of them, the rancher's widow and the schoolteacher, 20 years between them and no obvious common ground, who turned out to have exactly the same opinion of most things, expressed with slightly different language. Clara's school has 22 students. She wrote to a teacher's college in the East about what they'd built here, and a man came out to look at it and wrote something about it that was published somewhere, which Clara found interesting, and Nora found somewhat ridiculous, and Pearl found funny. I never read it. What I know about the school is that children who come through it can read and figure and survey, which is the minimum a person needs to not be taken advantage of, and that seemed to me the point from the beginning. Rosalind is running the freight operation from the old assay office, the WHDECKER prop building, which Decker the scoundrel would have found ironic. She remarried, eventually, to a man she chose on her own terms, a quiet man who keeps books for the settlement down the canyon, and had the good sense to recognize that Rosalind's intelligence was an asset and not a challenge to his. Thomas still runs the Garnet accounts, and has branched into working with 2 other operations in the county, which he manages from the same composed precision he brought to everything from the age of 9. Wren's beadwork is in collections I couldn't name. Buyers come to Garnet now, which she prefers over traveling to wherever they are. She has a teaching arrangement with 2 young women from the canyon settlement who want to learn the technical work, and she teaches it with the same measured patience Frances brings to medicine. Frances, I don't know, very old, still walks the morning circuit, still gives me remedies without explaining them and expects me to take them without asking, which I do. Pearl plays on Sunday evenings. Last Sunday she played well past the time she usually stops, and when I asked her about it afterward, she said she'd been in a good mood, and the room had been warm and the company had been worth playing for. I said I thought it was always worth playing for, and she said that was true, but some evenings it was more specifically worth it, and she'd looked at me while she said it with the same direct, level look she'd given me that April evening on the step, and I understood her meaning. I sat on that step last week, the April step, the angle of the late light, the canyon walls going gold. The cottonwood at the edge of the plaza was leafing out, the green of it still pale and new, the kind of green that only holds for about 2 weeks in spring before it deepens into summer. I'd planted that cottonwood in the second spring, from a cutting I'd brought from the creek, and I didn't know then if it would take. It took. It's 30 feet tall now, and the shade of it reaches most of the plaza in the afternoon, and the children climb it with Senor Bones. The original Senor Bones is long gone, but the name has passed to 2 subsequent cats, both of them thin, because Magdalena's youngest maintains that a cat named Senor Bones should be thin as a matter of aesthetic integrity. The well in the center of the plaza has a proper coping now, mortared stone, and a roof over it, and the rope and bucket are replaced each year before they wear through, which is Rosalind's item on the annual supply list, and which she treats with the seriousness she treats everything. The forge is running 3 days a week with a man I hired in the second year who turned out to know more about metalwork than I do, which is not damaging to say. I was a competent amateur and he's a craftsman, and the difference matters when you're making things that other people depend on. The boarding house is still the heart of the place, though it's been extended twice, and the original rooms have shifted purpose. Nora's room is still Nora's room. Mine is still mine at the end of the East Hall, with the window that catches the morning light and the sound of the plaza when things are happening in it. The dog's place under the cot has been empty since he died, and I haven't put anything there. Some spaces earn their emptiness. I thought about the man who'd driven up that road in November with a $5 deed and a nameless dog, and enough used-up faith in people to feel like weight in his chest. The man who decided that the best use of what was left of him was a worthless ghost town nobody else wanted. He would not know this place. He would look at the school bell I cast on the third try, and the cottonwood I grew from a cutting, and the 6 graves in the cemetery, and the 22 children in the schoolhouse and Pearl's Sunday evenings, and the smell of Nora's kitchen carrying into the street, and the 7 lives that chose this canyon and kept choosing it, year after year, with full knowledge of what they were choosing and why, and he would not be able to account for any of it from what he knew about himself when he arrived. That is the thing about stopping. A man can spend a long time in motion and be very capable and very alone and believe the motion is what the capability requires, that the competence and the solitude go together, that being useful to people and being valued by them are different scales, and he operates on the first one, not the second. He can believe that the regard of good people, the steady kind, the kind that names things after you and puts leaves on wood piles and presses beadwork into your hand and tells you plainly what you hold. He can believe that kind of regard is for other men. Men who had something he doesn't. It's only when you stop, when you put your hands to something and hold it and fix it and stand at its door for long enough, that you find out what you were worth all along. I was worth this. A town in a canyon, 7 women who chose it, one of them pressing her hand firm to my arm on an April evening and saying, "All 7 of us are yours now." Not a small thing. Not the kind of thing you can buy for $5 or any other sum. I stayed on the step a while after the sun went down. The air turned cool the way it does in the canyon after dark, and through the boarding house wall I could hear the sounds of the evening, Nora's step, a child's voice, Pearl's guitar starting up for the Sunday practice she does alone before she plays for everyone else. The dog would have been at my feet. He's not. But the rest of it is there, and the rest of it is enough, and more than enough, and I do not take a breath in this canyon that I do not know it. The kind of thing that only comes when a good woman, or, in my case, 7 of them, decides you're worth staying for. And you have the sense, finally, to hold still and let them,